The autumn rain drummed against the courthouse windows as Judge Margaret Harrison adjusted her silk scarf, the weight of another day's decisions pressing against her shoulders. At 52, she had earned her reputation as one of the city's most formidable judges, fair but unforgiving, wealthy beyond measure, yet somehow emptier with each passing year since her husband's death 3 years ago. Her black Mercedes glided through the morning streets, past the construction sites and bustling sidewalks where ordinary people hurried to ordinary jobs. Margaret barely noticed them anymore. Her world existed in boardrooms, courtrooms, and the marble halls of justice where her word was law. The leather seats cushioned her from the harsh realities beyond her tinted windows, a barrier she had carefully constructed between herself and a world that had taken everything that mattered. But this morning would be different. As her driver navigated through the downtown district, Margaret's attention was drawn to a commotion near the newly renovated Lincoln Elementary School. A small crowd had gathered, their voices carrying a mixture of concern and frustration. Against her better judgment, she found herself asking Thomas, her driver, to slow down. "What's happening there?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see a young woman in an orange reflective vest, a street cleaner, judging by the cart of supplies beside her. The woman couldn't have been more than 25, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her uniform soaked from the relentless drizzle. She was kneeling beside a small boy who appeared to be in distress, her gentle hands gesturing as she spoke to him in what seemed like soothing tones. The boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, was different. Margaret could see it even from her distance, the telltale signs of Down syndrome in his facial features, the way he held himself with that innocent vulnerability she had learned to recognize from her years presiding over family court cases. He was crying, his small body shaking with each sob, while other children kept their distance, some pointing and whispering. But this young street cleaner, this woman who society would dismiss as invisible, insignificant, she stayed. While teachers and parents seemed overwhelmed by the situation, she remained calm, patient, treating the boy with a tenderness that made Margaret's chest tighten with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. Margaret watched, transfixed, as the woman slowly reached into her cart and pulled out what appeared to be a small towel. She gently dried the boy's tears, then sat cross-legged on the wet pavement beside him, completely disregarding her own comfort. The rain continued to fall, but she didn't move. She simply stayed, creating a circle of safety around this child who needed her. "Ma'am?" Thomas's voice broke through her reverie. "Should we continue to the courthouse?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Something about the scene before her had awakened a memory, a distant echo of her own childhood when kindness from strangers had meant everything. She thought of her son, David, who would have been 30 this year if the accident hadn't claimed him along with her husband. David, who had always been drawn to helping others who might have appreciated this young woman's compassion. "Wait," she whispered, her breath fogging the window. "Just wait a moment." The street cleaner was now helping the boy to his feet, her movements careful and deliberate. She guided him toward what Margaret assumed was his school, one protective hand on his shoulder. But as they walked, Margaret noticed something that made her heart skip. The boy was limping heavily, his right leg dragging with each step. The young woman adjusted her pace without hesitation, allowing him to lean against her for support. In that moment, as Margaret watched this display of pure, unselfish kindness, she felt something crack open inside her chest, a wall she had built around her heart, brick by careful brick, to protect herself from further pain. This street cleaner, whose name she didn't know, whose story was a mystery, had just shown her something she had forgotten existed in the world. True compassion, given freely, expecting nothing in return. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her, "I need you to find out who that woman is." By noon, Margaret had the information she needed. The young woman's name was Sofia Elena Martinez, 24 years old, employed by the city's sanitation department for just over 2 years. single mother to a 6-year-old daughter named Isabella. No criminal record, no red flags, just a quiet life lived paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment on the east side of town. But numbers on a background check couldn't capture what Margaret had witnessed that morning. They couldn't explain the grace with which Sophia had handled that frightened boy, or the way she had sacrificed her own comfort without a second thought. Margaret found herself driving through Sophia's neighborhood that evening, telling herself she was simply curious. The area was a stark contrast to her own gated community. Chain-link fences instead of wrought iron, corner stores instead of boutiques, children playing on cracked sidewalks instead of manicured lawns. Yet there was something alive here, something authentic, that her pristine world seemed to lack. She spotted Sophia walking home from the bus stop, still in her orange vest, a small girl skipping beside her. Isabella, Margaret realized. The child was chattering animatedly, her hands gesturing wildly as she recounted what must have been her day at school. Sophia listened with complete attention, occasionally laughing at something her daughter said, her face transformed by pure joy. Margaret pulled over, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She had prosecuted countless cases involving negligent parents, had seen the damage that indifference could cause. But watching Sophia with Isabella was like seeing motherhood in its purest form, attentive, loving, present. It reminded her achingly of her own relationship with David before she had become so consumed with building her career, accumulating wealth, constructing the perfect life that had ultimately felt hollow. "Mummy, look!" Isabella's voice carried across the street as she pointed to a stray cat limping behind a dumpster. Without hesitation, Sophia approached the animal, speaking in soft Spanish as she assessed its injured paw. Margaret watched, mesmerized, as Sophia opened her lunch bag and offered the cat the sandwich she had undoubtedly been saving for her own dinner. The parallel to the morning's scene was impossible to ignore. Here was a woman whose instinct was always to help, to heal, to offer comfort, regardless of the cost to herself. "We can't take him home, Mija," Sophia said gently to Isabella, who had immediately fallen in love with the orange tabby. "But we can make sure he's fed until we find him a family." "Like you did with Mrs. Chen's dog?" Isabella asked, her eyes bright with the memory. "Exactly like that." Margaret's breath caught. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was who Sophia was, a woman who made helping others as natural as breathing. In her expensive car, surrounded by leather and luxury, Margaret felt smaller than she had in years. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of her usual route to the courthouse, she instructed Thomas to drive through the school district. She needed to see Sophia again, needed to understand what drove this young woman to such consistent kindness. She arrived just as Sophia was finishing her morning route, the streets around Lincoln Elementary, spotless, despite the ongoing construction. Sophia was loading her cart when a commotion erupted near the school's main entrance. It was the same boy from yesterday. Margaret could see his distinctive features even from a distance. He had fallen on the wet pavement, his books scattered, his lunchbox split open. Other children had gathered around, some laughing, others simply staring. But Sophia was already running. Margaret got out of her car, something she had never done in this neighborhood, and walked closer. She needed to see this up close, needed to understand. "Hey, Miguel, you're okay." Sophia's voice was calm, reassuring. She knelt beside the boy, ignoring the muddy water soaking through her uniform. "Let's get you cleaned up." Miguel, so that was his name, looked up at Sophia with complete trust. "I fell," he said simply, his speech slightly slurred, but clear enough. "I can see that, sweetheart. Falls happen. What matters is getting back up." Sophia's hands were gentle as she helped him to his feet, then methodically collected his scattered belongings. "Is anything hurt?" Miguel shook his head, but Margaret could see the embarrassment in his posture, the way he glanced at the other children who were still watching. "You know what?" Sophia said, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. I fall down sometimes too. Just last week, I tripped over my own feet carrying groceries. My daughter laughed so hard she got hiccups." Miguel giggled, the sound pure and delighted. "That's the Miguel smile I love to see," Sophia said, gently brushing dirt from his jacket. "Now, let's get you to class, before Mrs. Peterson marks you tardy." As they walked toward the school entrance, Miguel looked up at Sophia with unabashed adoration. "Sophia, are you an angel?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. From the mouth of this innocent boy came the exact word she had been searching for. Not saint, not hero, angel. Someone who appeared exactly when needed, who brought comfort without expecting anything in return. Sophia laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "No, sweetheart, I'm just Sophia, but thank you for thinking I'm special." "You are special," Miguel said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Margaret stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching this exchange, feeling her carefully constructed world shifting beneath her feet. This woman, this street cleaner who made minimum wage and rode the bus home to a cramped apartment, had just been given the greatest compliment imaginable, and she had deflected it with such humility that it only proved the boy's point. As Sophia disappeared into the school with Miguel, Margaret realized that she had just witnessed something she had spent years searching for in boardrooms and courtrooms and charity galas: genuine goodness. Not performed for recognition or reward, but simply because it was right. Standing there in her $1,000 suit, Margaret Harrison, who had everything money could buy, understood that she was looking at the richest person she had ever met. 3 days later, Margaret's world collided with Sophia's in a way neither could have anticipated. It was a Tuesday morning when Officer Patricia Reeves knocked on Sophia's apartment door at 6:15 a.m., her expression grave beneath her police cap. Sophia answered in her pajamas, Isabella still sleeping in the bedroom behind her, the scent of coffee and yesterday's rice and beans lingering in the small space. "Miss Martinez, we need to talk." The complaint had been filed anonymously. A report claiming that Sophia was harassing the children at Lincoln Elementary, that her interactions with the students were inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The words felt like poison on Sophia's tongue as Officer Reeves read them aloud. Someone had twisted her acts of kindness into something sinister, her gentle care for Miguel and other children into cause for suspicion. "I don't understand," Sophia whispered, her hands trembling as she held Isabella's school permission slip, a field trip to the zoo that would now have to wait. "I help the children. That's all I do. When they fall, when they're scared." "I believe you, Ma'am," Officer Reeves said quietly, her own discomfort evident. "But until this is investigated, you're suspended from your position. Effective immediately." By Thursday, the story had reached Margaret's courthouse, not through official channels, but through the whispered conversations that rippled through the city's professional community. A sanitation worker under investigation, inappropriate contact with disabled children. The details grew more distorted with each telling, until Sophia's acts of compassion had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Margaret felt sick. She had spent 48 hours trying to convince herself that this wasn't her concern. Sophia Martinez was a stranger, their lives intersected by pure coincidence. Margaret had her own cases, her own responsibilities, her own carefully ordered existence to maintain. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Miguel's face lighting up at the sight of Sophia. She heard his innocent question, "Are you an angel?" She remembered the absolute trust in his voice, the way other children naturally gravitated towards Sophia's gentle presence. This wasn't just wrong, it was a travesty. Friday morning found Margaret in an unprecedented situation, sitting in her car outside Sophia's apartment building, her legal training warring with her intuition. She had never involved herself in cases outside her jurisdiction, had never allowed personal feelings to override professional boundaries. But she had also never witnessed injustice this pure, this cruel. She climbed the narrow stairs to apartment 2B, each step taking her further from the world she knew and deeper into one she had only observed from a distance. The building smelled of cooking oil and cleaning supplies, sounds of family life echoing from behind thin walls. Children laughing, televisions murmuring in Spanish, someone practicing piano scales with determined imperfection. Sophia answered the door on the third knock, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her face pale with exhaustion. She was wearing the same clothes Margaret had seen her in yesterday, suggesting she hadn't slept. Isabella peeked out from behind her mother's legs, her usual bright smile replaced by confusion and worry. "Can I help you?" Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. Margaret realized she had no idea how to begin. She was Judge Margaret Harrison, accustomed to commanding courtrooms and boardrooms, but standing before this young woman whose life was unraveling, she felt powerless. "My name is Margaret Harrison. I'm a judge with the family court system." She watched Sophia's face crumble, assuming this was another official here to make things worse. "I'm not here in any official capacity. I'm here because I've been watching you." And the words sounded wrong the moment they left her mouth. Sophia stepped back, pulling Isabella closer. "That came out wrong," Margaret said quickly. "What I mean is, I witnessed what you did for that boy, Miguel, at the school. I saw how you helped him, how gentle you were, and I know these accusations against you are lies." Sophia's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she sank onto her small couch, Isabella immediately climbing into her lap with the intuitive comfort that only children can provide. "They're saying I hurt children," Sophia sobbed. "They're saying I'm dangerous. But I could never." She looked at Isabella, her voice breaking. "How do I explain to my daughter that sometimes people lie about good things and make them seem bad?" Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. A determination she hadn't felt since her own son's death had left her hollow. This woman, who had shown nothing but kindness, was being destroyed by someone's cruelty or misunderstanding. And Margaret, who had spent years hiding behind judicial robes and legal precedents, suddenly knew exactly what she had to do. "You don't have to face this alone," Margaret said, the words surprising herself. "I want to help you fight this." Sophia looked up through her tears, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Margaret replied, thinking of Miguel's trusting smile, of the stray cat Sophia had fed, of the patience she showed Isabella every single day. "I know you're exactly the kind of person this world needs more of. And I know that if we let them destroy you for being kind, we're all lost." But as Margaret spoke those words, she saw the real challenge looming before them. Sophia wasn't just fighting false accusations. She was fighting a system that had already judged her based on her clothes, her neighborhood, her accent, her status as a single mother working a job most people considered beneath notice. How do you prove someone's goodness in a world that had forgotten what goodness looked like? The investigation proved to be a labyrinth of bureaucracy and prejudice that threatened to swallow Sophia whole. Margaret discovered that the anonymous complaint had been filed by someone claiming to represent concerned parents, but when she pressed for specifics, the details became frustratingly vague. The complainant alleged that Sophia had been overly physical with students and had singled out Miguel for inappropriate attention. Margaret's first strategy was direct. She arranged a meeting with Principal Anderson at Lincoln Elementary, confident that her reputation and position would carry weight. She walked into the school's main office on Monday morning, her presence commanding immediate attention from the secretary, who recognized her from newspaper photos. "Judge Harrison," Principal Anderson said nervously, adjusting his tie as he led her into his cramped office. "This is quite unexpected. How can we help you?" "I'm here about Sophia Martinez," Margaret said without preamble. "The allegations against her are baseless, and I believe you know it." Principal Anderson's face flushed. "Judge Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but this is a delicate situation. We have to take all complaints seriously, especially when they involve the safety of our special needs students. What exactly did you witness that raised concerns? Margaret pressed. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Well, I didn't personally witness anything inappropriate, but then what about the other teachers, the playground monitors? Anyone? Another pause. The complaint was very specific about Ms. Martinez's behavior being unusual. Margaret leaned forward. Unusual how? For showing kindness to a child who was hurt, for treating Miguel with the same dignity she'd show any other human being. Judge Harrison, with respect, you don't understand the complexities involved here. Ms. Martinez is, well, she's not exactly qualified to work with special needs children. She's a sanitation worker. People might get the wrong idea about her intentions. The words hit Margaret like a slap. In that moment, she understood exactly what they were up against. This wasn't about Sophia's actions. This was about who Sophia was perceived to be. A poor Hispanic single mother whose kindness was viewed with suspicion simply because it came from someone society had deemed invisible. Margaret's second attempt came through official channels. She used her connections to request the investigation files, hoping to find inconsistencies or evidence of bias. But the system that had always worked for her suddenly felt like quicksand. Every inquiry was met with delays, every request buried under procedural requirements. We need witnesses, Margaret told Sophia during one of their evening meetings in Sophia's small living room. Isabella was doing homework at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing over at the two women with the intuitive understanding that something important was happening. We need people who can testify to your character, to what they've actually seen you do. But finding witnesses proved harder than either of them anticipated. The other school employees were afraid to speak up, worried about their own jobs. Parents who had seen Sophia help their children suddenly became hard to reach when the investigation was mentioned. The construction workers who saw her daily interactions with students claimed they didn't really pay attention to what happened on school grounds. Even more devastating was the discovery that Miguel's own mother, Rosa, had been told by the school district that speaking on Sophia's behalf could jeopardize Miguel's placement in the special education program. The woman who had been so grateful for Sophia's kindness was now terrified to acknowledge it publicly. "I'm so sorry," Rosa whispered to Sophia during a chance encounter at the grocery store, her eyes filled with tears. "They said, if I get involved, Miguel might lose his aid. I can't risk that. He needs the help." Sophia nodded, understanding completely, but Margaret watched her shoulders sag with each lost ally. The system was protecting itself by silencing the very people who could prove Sophia's innocence. The final blow came on a Thursday evening, when Margaret's private investigator, someone she had hired discreetly to dig deeper into the complaint, returned with troubling news. The anonymous tip hadn't been filed by a parent at all. It had come from someone within the school district itself, someone who had deliberately chosen to remain hidden while destroying Sophia's life. "It's someone with access to personnel files," the investigator explained, sliding a folder across Margaret's dining room table. They knew specific details about Ms. Martinez's employment history, her address, her daughter's school records. This wasn't a concerned parent. This was someone with inside knowledge and a specific agenda. Margaret stared at the evidence, her blood growing cold. Why would someone in the school district want to hurt Sophia? That's what we need to find out. But Judge Harrison, I have to warn you, if this goes deeper than we thought, if there are people in positions of power who want Ms. Martinez gone, they'll come after anyone who tries to help her, including you. That night, Margaret sat in her empty mansion, surrounded by all the trappings of success that had once meant everything to her. Her awards lined the walls. Her degrees hung in frames, her bank accounts held more money than Sophia would see in a lifetime. But none of it could help the one person who had reminded her what it meant to be truly human. She thought about her son David, about the conversations they used to have about justice and fairness. He would have loved Sophia, would have been the first to stand up for her. But David was gone, and Margaret was left to carry on alone, fighting a battle she wasn't sure she could win. As she prepared for bed, Margaret realized that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about helping Sophia and had become about saving her own soul. Because if someone like Sophia could be destroyed for the crime of being good, then what hope was there for any of them? The phone rang at midnight. It was Sophia, her voice shaking with terror. "Judge Harrison, they came to my apartment. Someone left a note under my door. It says if I don't withdraw my appeal and leave town quietly, something terrible will happen to Isabella." Margaret felt her world tilt on its axis. This wasn't just about reputation anymore. This was about a 6-year-old girl whose only crime was having a mother who dared to show kindness in a world that had forgotten its value. Margaret arrived at Sophia's apartment within 20 minutes. Her usual composure replaced by a fierce protectiveness she hadn't felt since David was young. She found Sophia pacing her small living room like a caged animal. Isabella, asleep on the couch, clutched to her favorite stuffed elephant, blissfully unaware of the danger swirling around her. The note was simple, printed on plain white paper. "Take your daughter and leave. Stop fighting this. Some battles aren't worth your child's safety." "We're calling the police," Margaret said immediately, but Sophia shook her head. "And tell them what? That someone left an anonymous note that doesn't technically threaten anything specific? You know the system better than I do. They'll file a report and do nothing." Sophia's voice was hollow with despair. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should just disappear." "Absolutely not." Margaret's voice carried the authority of decades in courtrooms. "We don't negotiate with bullies, and we don't abandon truth because it's inconvenient for someone else." But even as she spoke those brave words, Margaret felt the weight of her own limitations. For all her power and connections, she had been unable to make meaningful progress. The faceless enemy seemed always one step ahead, protected by shadows and bureaucracy. It was then that Margaret made a decision that would have shocked her younger self. She called in a favor from someone she had sworn never to contact again, Detective Maria Santos, her late husband's former partner, who had left the force under controversial circumstances, but now ran a private security firm specializing in cases the system wouldn't touch. "Margaret, it's been 3 years since the funeral. I thought you'd written me off forever." Maria's voice carried old hurt alongside professional curiosity. "I need help, Maria. And I need someone who isn't afraid to break a few rules." 24 hours later, Maria sat in Margaret's study, her weathered face serious as she reviewed the case files. She had aged in the years since Margaret had seen her, more grey in her dark hair, deeper lines around her eyes, but her instincts remained razor-sharp. "This stinks of a cover-up," Maria said bluntly. "Someone wants this woman gone badly enough to fabricate a case against her. The question is why. What threat does a street cleaner pose to anyone with real power?" They were about to find out. Maria's contacts in the school district ran deeper than Margaret had realized. Within 48 hours, she had uncovered a trail of financial irregularities that made Margaret's blood boil. Lincoln Elementary's Special Education Fund, money designated specifically for children like Miguel, had been systematically siphoned off through a series of fake vendor contracts and inflated service fees. The theft had been going on for over 2 years, totaling nearly $200,000 in funds meant to provide aid services, therapeutic equipment, and specialized programs for the district's most vulnerable students. Money that could have changed lives had instead lined the pockets of 3 school district administrators working in coordination with a corrupt contracting company. "But what does this have to do with Sophia?" Margaret asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would break her heart. Maria pulled out a series of photographs, surveillance images from the school's security system that she had obtained through channels Margaret didn't want to know about. The images showed Sophia's daily interactions with Miguel, But they also showed something else. Sophia consistently staying late to help clean areas that should have been covered by the contracted janitorial service that was billing the district for work never performed. Your Sophia wasn't just being kind, Maria explained. She was being thorough, too thorough. She was inadvertently documenting the fact that the cleaning services the district was paying premium prices for weren't actually being provided. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Sophia's dedication to doing her job well, her natural instinct to go above and beyond, had made her a liability to people stealing from disabled children. Her kindness hadn't just been misconstrued, it had been weaponized against her by criminals who needed her gone to protect their scheme. "There's more," Maria continued grimly. "The complaint wasn't random. It was specifically crafted to ensure Sophia could never work around schools again. They didn't just want her fired. They wanted her destroyed professionally so she could never stumble across their operation again." Margaret felt a rage building inside her that dwarfed anything she had experienced in her years on the bench. These people hadn't just attacked Sophia. They had attacked the very concept of goodness itself, turning her compassion into a weapon against her, while they robbed the children she cared about. Who? Margaret's voice was barely controlled. Who did this to her? Maria slid 3 personnel files across the desk. District Finance Director Harold Pemberton, Special Education Coordinator Linda Walsh, Facilities Management Supervisor Robert Chen. All of them respected members of the educational community, all of them pillars of fake respectability built on the backs of disabled children. "Pemberton filed the complaint," Maria said. "He's been watching Sophia for months, documenting her routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. When she started spending extra time with Miguel, showing him kindness that highlighted the neglect these kids were experiencing due to the stolen resources, he knew he had his excuse." Margaret stood at her window, looking out at the city lights, thinking about Sophia crying in her apartment, terrified for her daughter's safety because she had dared to be good in a world that punished goodness. She thought about Miguel, who would never know that the woman he called an angel had been destroyed by people who should have been protecting him. "Maria," she said quietly, her voice carrying the cold precision that had made her legendary in the courtroom, "I want you to gather every piece of evidence we have, every document, every photograph, every financial record." "What are you planning, Margaret?" Margaret turned from the window, and Maria saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there since her husband and son died, a burning purpose that made her seem 10 years younger and infinitely more dangerous. "I'm planning to remind some very corrupt people why they should never have underestimated a woman who has spent her entire career fighting for justice," Margaret said. "And I'm going to make sure that Sophia Martinez gets something she's never had before. Someone with real power willing to fight for her the way she fights for everyone else." The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret felt like they had a chance. Because now she knew exactly who their enemies were, and more importantly, she knew exactly how to destroy them. The emergency school board meeting was called for Thursday evening at 7 p.m., just 24 hours after Margaret had delivered a comprehensive dossier of evidence to every board member, the district attorney, and 3 local news stations. The usually sleepy administrative building buzzed with an energy that crackled like electricity before a storm. Margaret arrived early, her presence commanding immediate attention from the gathering crowd, but she wasn't alone. Maria flanked her right side, carrying boxes of evidence that would destroy careers and send people to prison. And on her left, walking with quiet dignity despite everything she had endured, was Sophia Martinez. Sophia had wanted to stay home with Isabella, terrified of what public exposure might bring. But Margaret had convinced her that hiding would only give their enemies more power. "They've spent weeks painting you as someone to fear," Margaret had told her. "It's time for people to see who you really are." The boardroom filled quickly. Harold Pemberton sat in the front row, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy as he repeatedly checked his phone. Linda Walsh whispered urgently with Robert Chen near the back exit, their faces pale with the realization that their carefully constructed world was about to collapse. But the most important attendees weren't the adults. They were the children and families whose lives had been affected by both the corruption and Sophia's kindness. Rosa had finally found her courage, arriving with Miguel, who immediately lit up when he saw Sophia across the room. Other parents had come too, families who had quietly benefited from Sophia's gentle care but had been too afraid to speak up during the investigation. Board President Rebecca Thompson called the meeting to order, her voice tight with the strain of a crisis she hadn't seen coming. We're here tonight to address serious allegations that have been brought to our attention regarding financial irregularities in our special education programs, as well as to review the investigation of Ms. Sophia Martinez. Margaret rose from her seat with the fluid grace of someone who had commanded courtrooms for decades. Board members, my name is Judge Margaret Harrison. I'm here tonight not in any official capacity, but as a citizen who has witnessed a grave injustice being perpetrated in our community. She moved to the front of the room, her voice carrying to every corner. 3 weeks ago, Sophia Martinez was suspended from her job and subjected to an investigation based on allegations that she had inappropriate contact with students. Tonight, I'm here to present evidence that those allegations were not just false. They were deliberately fabricated to silence a woman whose only crime was doing her job too well. The room erupted in murmurs, but Margaret continued, her voice cutting through the noise. Ms. Martinez unknowingly became a witness to systematic theft from programs designed to help our most vulnerable children. Rather than address the corruption she had inadvertently exposed, certain individuals chose to destroy her reputation and threaten her family's safety. Harold Pemberton shot to his feet. This is outrageous. Judge Harrison, you have no right to make accusations. Sit down, Mr. Pemberton. Margaret's voice could have frozen fire. You'll have your chance to explain yourself to a jury. Maria stepped forward, opening the first box of evidence. Financial records spilled across the table, fake invoices, fraudulent contracts, bank statements showing money diverted from special needs programs into personal accounts. Over the past 2 years, Margaret continued, her voice clinical and devastating, Harold Pemberton, Linda Walsh, and Robert Chen orchestrated the theft of nearly $200,000 in special education funds. Money that should have provided aid services for children like Miguel Rodriguez was instead used to fund personal expenses and luxury purchases. Miguel, sitting in his mother's lap, raised his hand with the innocent curiosity that had first captivated Sophia. Why would they steal from kids like me? The question hung in the air, like an indictment. Harold Pemberton's face crumbled. The weight of a child's simple honesty more devastating than any legal proceeding could have been. But it was what happened next that would be remembered long after the trials ended and the criminals were sentenced. Sophia, who had spent weeks in hiding, who had been terrorized and threatened and nearly broken by their attacks, stood up and walked over to Miguel. They made bad choices, sweetheart, she said gently, kneeling beside his chair. But the important thing is that good people are going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Are you coming back to clean our school? Miguel asked, his eyes bright with hope. Sophia looked at Margaret, uncertainty flickering in her expression. Even with the corruption exposed, even with her innocence proven, the damage to her reputation might be permanent. Who would hire someone who had been publicly accused, even if the accusations were proven false? Margaret felt the weight of the moment. This was it, the decisive instant where they could either restore Sophia's life or watch the criminals' victory become complete despite their exposure. Miguel, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of her position but the warmth of genuine affection. Sophia is going to do much more than clean your school. I'm recommending to the board that she be hired as the new special education student advocate, a position that will let her work directly with children like you every single day. Dudum, the gasps in the room were audible. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears. Tears of possibility rather than despair. Board President Thompson looked stunned. Judge Harrison, that's not a position that currently exists. Then create it, Margaret said simply. Fund it with the money you'll recover from these thieves. Make Sophia's compassion an official part of this school district instead of something that happens by accident. Let her be what she's always been, an angel watching over your most vulnerable students. Miguel clapped his hands with delight, and suddenly the entire room seemed to shift. Other parents began to speak up, sharing stories of Sophia's kindness that had been silenced by fear but not forgotten. The construction workers who had claimed not to notice came forward with testimonies of daily acts of care. Even some teachers found their courage, admitting they had always known the accusations were false, but had been too afraid to speak. As Harold Pemberton was led away in handcuffs and the corrupt administrators faced the collapse of their carefully constructed lies, Sophia found herself surrounded by children and families whose lives she had touched without even realizing it. But the most important moment came when she looked across the room at Margaret, the powerful judge who had risked everything to fight for someone society had deemed invisible, and saw not just gratitude, but recognition. They had saved each other, these two women from completely different worlds, proving that goodness could triumph when people with courage chose to stand together. The battle was over. Justice had won. And in a small elementary school district, an angel would finally be free to spread her wings. 6 months later, Margaret stood at her office window watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the courthouse steps. The city looked the same as it always had, but everything felt different now. The emptiness that had echoed through her life since losing David and her husband had been filled with something she hadn't expected to find again, purpose that went beyond courtrooms and legal victories. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Miguel's reading improved 2 grade levels. Thank you for believing in us. S. Margaret smiled, thinking about Sophia's new office at Lincoln Elementary. It was small and cramped, wedged between the nurse's station and the principal's office, but Sophia had transformed it into something magical. The walls were covered with children's artwork, thank you notes from parents, and photos of students celebrating their achievements. Most importantly, it had an open door, literally and figuratively, for any child who needed someone to listen, to help, or simply to see them as valuable. The position of special education student advocate had become so successful that 3 other districts had created similar roles. Sophia's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Treat every child with dignity, meet them where they are, and never underestimate what kindness can accomplish. She had developed programs that paired struggling students with peer mentors, created safe spaces for children who felt different or left out, and somehow managed to reduce disciplinary problems by 40%, simply by making sure every child knew someone cared about them. But Sophia's transformation went beyond her professional success. The scared, isolated young woman Margaret had met in that cramped apartment had blossomed into a confident advocate who spoke at school board meetings, testified before the state legislature about special needs funding, and had become a voice for families who had never had one before. Margaret's own life had changed just as dramatically. She had started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, using her skills to help people who couldn't afford justice. She had reconnected with Maria Santos, and their renewed friendship had filled a loneliness she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Most importantly, she had learned that wealth and power meant nothing unless they were used to lift others up. The corruption trials had been swift and decisive. Harold Pemberton received 5 years in federal prison. Linda Walsh and Robert Chen got 3 years each. The recovered funds had not only created Sophia's position, but had also provided new resources for special education programs throughout the district. Miguel now had a full-time aide, new therapeutic equipment, and access to programs that were helping him thrive academically and socially, but the real victory wasn't measured in convictions or recovered money. It was measured in the ripple effects of recognition. Sophia's story had been covered by national news, not as a feel-good human interest piece, but as an example of how ordinary people doing extraordinary things could change the world if someone with power was willing to notice and act. The story had inspired other invisible workers to share their own experiences of going above and beyond. Janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, and maintenance staff began receiving recognition for the ways they quietly cared for students. A movement had started, one that valued character over credentials and measured success by compassion rather than just academic achievement. On this particular morning, Margaret had a special reason for watching from her window. Today was the dedication ceremony for the new Lincoln Elementary Special Education Center, a state-of-the-art facility funded by a combination of recovered stolen money, district bonds, and private donations that had poured in from around the country after Sophia's story went viral. Margaret drove herself to the ceremony, no longer needing Thomas to navigate the world beyond her gated community. She had learned to find joy in the ordinary neighborhoods she had once passed by without seeing, discovering that authentic life existed in the places she had overlooked. The ceremony was perfect in its imperfection. Children's voices mixed with adult conversations. Wheelchairs and walkers navigated around folding chairs, and the spring breeze kept threatening to blow away the carefully prepared speeches. Sophia stood at the podium, radiant in a simple blue dress, Isabella beside her wearing a miniature version of her mother's outfit and beaming with pride. "I used to think that helping people was just something you did when you had extra time or energy," Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "I thought kindness was a luxury that people like me couldn't always afford. But I learned something important this year. Kindness isn't something we give when we have enough. It's something we give especially when we don't. And when we choose kindness anyway, that's when miracles happen." She looked directly at Margaret, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude and joy. "Someone once told me that angels appear exactly when they're needed most. I thought she was talking about me, but I was wrong. Angels come in all forms. Sometimes they're judges who risk everything for justice, sometimes they're investigators who refuse to let truth stay buried, and sometimes they're entire communities who choose to stand up for what's right instead of what's easy." Miguel stepped forward holding a plaque that read, "The Sofia Martinez Special Education Center, where every child is seen, heard, and valued." He handed it to Sophia with the same trusting smile that had started this entire journey. "Thank you for seeing me," he said simply, and Sophia knelt down to hug him, her tears falling freely now. Margaret felt her own tears coming, but they were different from the bitter tears she had shed for years after losing her family. These were tears of completion, of purpose fulfilled, of a life that had found meaning again through the simple act of choosing to see goodness and fight for it. As the ceremony ended and families gathered for the reception, Isabella ran up to Margaret with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old. "Judge Margaret, Mommy says you're the reason everything good happened. Are you really an angel too?" Margaret knelt down to Isabella's level, thinking about her son David, about the conversation they would have had about this moment, about the pride he would have felt seeing his mother become the person she was meant to be. "No, sweetheart," she said, smoothing Isabella's hair with gentle hands. "I'm just someone who learned that the most important cases aren't the ones decided in courtrooms. They're the ones decided in our hearts when we choose to believe that everyone deserves someone fighting for them." Isabella nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Want to see my mum's new office? She has pictures of all her kids on the wall, and she says I can visit whenever I want." As Isabella dragged her toward the building, Margaret caught Sophia's eye one more time. They shared a look of understanding that needed no words. Two women who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had discovered that the most powerful force in the world wasn't law or money or status, but simply the willingness to see someone else's worth and fight for it with everything you have. In the end, Margaret realized she hadn't saved Sophia at all. Sophia had saved her simply by being exactly who she was, a street cleaner who treated every person she met as if they mattered, because she understood a truth that Margaret had forgotten. We all matter, we're all worthy of kindness, and sometimes the most ordinary among us are the ones who remind the rest of us how to be human.